David, thank you so much for agreeing to have a conversation with me about the Great Leadership Project, or in relation to the Great Leadership Project. And the reason I've asked you to have this conversation with me is because I think you're an expert in decision making, and or at least that's how I think of you. And 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 of course, one of the things that defines great leadership is the ability to take decisions, rather than not take decisions, or take poor decisions. So I think for people to understand the nature of decision making and what how it really works is really helpful to them. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, and how, and this sort of expertise in decision making, and how you came to that and what it means.
Yeah, good. Well, great to be here, Neil. Wonderful to be speaking with you. So I'm David Rodin. I'm a moral philosopher, and I also run and founded a small advisory firm called Principia, which really works on organizational ethics with a lot of the largest businesses and organizations in the world. But I really am first and foremost a moral philosopher. So I was born in New Zealand, grew up in New Zealand. I came to the UK to study. I did the BPhil and then my doctorate in Oxford in moral philosophy, and then spent 20 years at Oxford, really, researching and running various research groups there. So my particular area of academic work that I'm, I guess, best known for is my work in the ethics of war and military ethics, which is a very, very interesting field that had kind of become neglected for a long time. It's a very, very long history. Going back to the kind of early Christian thinkers and beyond that, it become somewhat neglected. And I was very fortunate, I guess, to have been part of a generation of younger scholars that really had the opportunity to kind of rethink this field pretty much from the ground up. It was also a very, obviously, very dynamic period politically with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think there was a receptivity to thinking about the ethics of international relations, the ethics of force, and military ethics in a very, very different way. So I was part of a movement that came to be called revisionist just war theory, that really tried to rethink the ethics of military action very much from the perspective of the status of individuals, whereas traditionally the starting point had been, okay, we have these states, these are the entities that really matter. We think about the rights and responsibilities of states and their relationship to each other. And what revisionists tried to do is to say, actually, the human person is really at the center of this. We have to start thinking about the rights and responsibilities of soldiers, of civilians, of leaders in that context of what we owe to others. So through that, I started to, I was never one of these philosophers or academics who kind of just wanted to be in the armchair. Although I do have a rather philosophical armchair there that gives a lot of theoretical use. But it was very important to me to be, I went into moral philosophy because I think that questions of ethics are, incredibly important to us individually and collectively, and that it's the job of a good moral philosopher to really try and assist the world through the tools that a philosopher brings, which is around clarity of thinking and discrimination and decision making. To come back to that, so I ended up doing a lot of work with different militaries around the world. A lot of training and leadership development work. So for many, many years now, I've been involved with senior officer training for the UK, tri-services, worked with many militaries around Europe, done a lot of work in the US with the US Army. And, it was wonderful work to have the opportunity, to really engage with officers and soldiers who are making, the most difficult, pressing decisions you can possibly imagine, literally decisions about life and death. So the work that I guess I'm doing now with Principia, to kind of come full circle to your question around leadership decision making, came a little bit, perhaps fortuitously or kind of randomly, perhaps is a better word. But I was asked 7 years ago in 2014 to help out one of the big US Wall Street banks who had, were having a pretty torrid time. They'd been bailed out in 2008. almost gone bankrupt, and they had essentially had a kind of a string of just terrible scandals and then kind of ethical problems. So the CEO of this bank kind of came and said, look, I know you work on ethics, on leadership. We've got this big problem in the bank. People keep doing these terrible things, and we keep getting these fines. And I remember these are very memorably, and these fines have a B at the end of them, not an M. So we're talking, not millions, not billions, but tens of billions of dollars. So the question was really, how do we try and understand what's going on? Because it was pretty clear that this was not just a kind of compliance failure. They had a massive compliance department that invested hugely in it, kept having these problems. So it was pretty clear that something else was going on, something that was essentially cultural and ethical. There was something about the organization, the way that it was interacting with its individual leaders and staff, that was creating a context that was enabling or permitting some pretty terrible behaviors. So I pulled together some colleagues, and we basically embarked on a kind of root cause assessment. So we went through the whole organization. There's 200,000 employees, 200 different markets. We developed some, what back then relatively primitive, but are now very sophisticated kind of quantitative analytical tools, survey tools, ways of kind of really investigating the data they had internally. We spent a lot of time just talking to different leaders, trying to understand how they had thought about what had gone on, the ways in which the organization created a context for them to talk about and broach ethical issues, the ways in which it kind of guided those or created a set of values or a sense of purpose that would frame those decisions. And it became pretty clear that the causes of what had happened were certainly not unidimensional. I think there was a tendency at that time to think about the causes of some, certainly the banking sector, as being, largely around, well, very significantly around bonuses and incentives. And what we discovered through our work is that was certainly part of the issue, but it was by no means the only part, and it was probably not even the greater part. So we did a lot of work with the bank around creating, so first of all, looking at those incentive systems and attempting to remove kind of perverse incentives or blocking incentives. But once you've done that, to really start to create a cultural environment where leaders viewed it as part of their role to, have these discussions openly and honestly, and to start learning how to deploy and to utilize and internalize some of the, more sophisticated skills that, that a philosopher like myself would want to bring to ethical decision making. So our work in Principia kind of, grew from that. Today, we're a group of over 40 professionals, some who are kind of full-time consultants, but others of whom are kind of part-time academics like myself, who have roles in research universities and kind of step out to do this kind of work. So I guess in terms of your question around decision-making, I would view that as really, so the kind of work that we do around ethics as really being kind of one component of a broader domain of decision making. And it's interesting because when you think about decision making is always done within the context of some framework of kind of rational normativity, right? So, and most often when we think about that, the kind of the framework of kind of rational normativity that we're envisaging is essentially a kind of self-interested one. So we say, well, Neil is acting rationally this is the way economists think about the dictionary. Neil is acting rationally insofar as his actions, maximize his own long-term utility, or however you want to describe that. And some variant of that is pretty much implicit within, most of the background assumptions of most views of kind of corporate strategy as well. So, an organization is acting rationally insofar as those actions contribute towards attaining its long-term strategic objectives. So it's a kind of largely, essentially hedonic, self-interested conception of what it means to make a good decision and what it means for those decisions to be rational. And what I find really, interesting and exciting about ethics is it gives you an entirely different way to think about normativity and rationality, and therefore good decision making. Because what the ethicist will say is that an action that is entirely self-interested but does not take into account the broader obligations that we may owe to other people, to other living beings, to other stakeholders, that doesn't take into account the kind of the duties and the rights of others, is not actually fully rational. It's not rational because it's missing out this huge part of what it means for decisions to be good, which is that they are responding in an appropriate way to these broader ethical reasons. So, our job as moral philosophers, and as it were, as something of guides to leaders in decision making, is, I think, really to help to kind of develop or to elicit or to bring out those set of skills of kind of, first of all, of becoming aware of, and then being able to appropriately respond to those set of kind of ethical, normative, rational considerations, very much in the way that an MBA school will teach an aspiring leader how to analyze a market opportunity and create a product and pursue a set of strategic objectives. What we are asking the leaders to do is to internalize a very comparable set of skills, but around how to make decisions and position your organization so as to be a fully responsible, ethical organization.
Okay, cool. So what I'm hearing here is two things which I think are really useful to the leaders that we talk to. One is the sort of instant decision. So if I'm in the military, it hardly gets more instant than that. Someone at some point is making this life or death decisions or whatever, but they're making their potential to make instant decisions, need to make instant decisions is really important. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's more strategic decisions where you've got the opportunity to be more considered, to be more consultative, more inclusive, and so on. So it's great that we've got that spectrum, and of course, that need for instant decisions occurs in business, and the need for strategic decisions occurs in the military. So it goes across.
Yeah, although I think I would push back a little bit around that dichotomy. I mean, of course, you're right. There are decisions we have a lot more time and decisions that we made very, very rapidly. But one of the hallmarks of an organization that takes ethical decision-making seriously is that you take the opportunity to preempt those decisions, because even those decisions, they are, they are very, very immediate. You never know exactly the context that they're going to arise in, but you know the kinds of contexts that they're going to arise in, the kinds of decisions you're going to be asked to make. So organizations that do this well really equip their people with the appropriate kind of frameworks exactly for this reason, so that when something, highly charged, and this, and it doesn't need to be something as kind of immediately personal as a kind of, wartime fire or not situation. No. The boards deal with this kind of thing, very rapidly emerging situation, which may actually be a very big strategic issue for them. They can arise very, very rapidly. And if the organization hasn't done the work to clarify, what the terms of values are that are going to frame this decision, to work through the parameters and the ways in which these decisions will be made, you can very quickly find yourself in a bad place.
So the question I was going to ask is, at the one end of the scale you've got quick decisions, at the other end of the scale you've got decisions where you've got more time. So I love that, the idea that you're socializing, enculturing a framework of values or beliefs that provide the basis of decisions. So I guess my questions are, what are the key bits of that? Who are the populations that you want to be including? How do you keep that up to date? Those sort of questions. How, in practical terms, how do you make these things real?
Yeah. So maybe let me just start with a kind of another dichotomy that we find really helpful. So if you think about the kind of the range of ethical challenges that leaders and organizations face, there are some that we kind of think of as being more like hygiene. So if you think in the health context, there are some things that we know are just really important to do and get right on a regular basis. You know, brushing your teeth, eating a healthy diet, getting good exercise. We all know what they are. There's no great mystery. It's not always easy to do them consistently. So the challenge is really just around creating the environment where you can just do that stuff consistently day in and day out. And there's a bunch of ethical things that are like that as well. The kind of bread and butter ethical decisions, making sure that your people are honest, that you treat customers with proper respect, that there's no theft or fraud or dangerous products. No great mystery about any of that at all.
No.
Can be incredibly difficult to do that at scale over a large organization across that is really, really difficult. And to do that absolutely consistently day in and day out, 24/7. On the other end of the spectrum, there are challenges that are just genuinely very, very difficult to know what the right answer is. And those kinds of issues often arise around new technology. They will often arise at moments of rapid social transition, like we're having at the moment, where a number of kind of ethical, cultural, political attributes or claims are very much contested and up for grabs. And in those cases, the challenge is very, very different. It can be genuinely difficult to know what the right answer is. So the skill sets that are required for these two different, the kind of hygiene versus these kind of frontier issues are very, very difficult, very different rather. In the first case, it's much more around creating a set of processes and a set of skills and cultural attributes that enables your people just to get the basic stuff done really, really consistently and to make sure that it always gets done in the right way. On the kind of frontier stuff, it's much more around the kinds of things that a philosopher would do to investigate what we really think the right answer for us as an organization is to take on this situation. Now, in terms of your kind of dichotomy between fast and slow, what's interesting to me is that either of those can occur in either of those two ways. So even at these kind of really difficult frontier type issues, they can occur very slowly. If you think about a new product cycle where you're taking months or maybe years to develop it, you've got the time to step back and reflect and take due consideration and to to talk widely to stakeholders. But not always. I mean, there are, if you think about the situation that a lot of firms have faced with operations in Shenzhen or in Hong Kong, where overnight something can happen that can face you with really quite a profound question around how you're going to respond to that. It needs to be done very, very rapidly. So I think it's interesting to me that you can have those really quite difficult, as it were, strategic level frontier issues arise both in a very quick or in a longer term manner. And I think in both cases, it really, really helps to have a decision-making framework that can guide your approach to that. So if you think about what the different components of that are and how you get to it, the first element is really to have kind of tested and clarified and articulated the values that you believe are really foundational and really important to the way that you want to run your organization. And when a lot of organizations think about values, think about the 5 or 6, which almost always have integrity and respect that kind of sits on the website. At that kind of level of generality, that's not particularly helpful. The way that you really get to a sense of values that can help to guide and frame a decision is to test those and think about those as they apply in particular concrete, in really difficult, challenging concrete decisions, and particularly to think about them where there are trade-offs, between them. And that's where you really get to kind of clarify, okay, when push comes to shove, what are the ones that we really, really think have a kind of special force and that we really want to maintain at all costs? which are the ones that we believe, it might be sometimes appropriate to allow to trade off, and what circumstances, and how do you do that? So the way that you can kind of often do that very effectively is to kind of start, gaming and scenario planning them. So, what we often find is that boards and leaders will go through a process of kind of, and you can base it on real world events, but, you can kind of game plan that through and say, okay, if we really pushed on this, how do we make these trade-offs, and what do we really take to be really significant? And what we often ask leaders to consider in this process is to think very carefully about what the red lines are. So this is a concept that very much from the military, where they think in any kind of action, it's really important to frame the kind of option space just around the red lines that are just kind of non-negotiable, and to be quite clear about that going in. So to make that distinction between the kind of non-negotiable red lines and then the other values that are clearly important, but that have to be navigated and traded off against each other.
What's the relationship between personal values, the individual values of those leaders, and the stated corporate values? Or is that exactly where the purpose of that debate and negotiation?
Yeah, it is, and it's a great question, actually, because what's distinctive about any kind of social action, not just corporations or organization, any kind of social action, is that we're kind of navigating or combining a whole bunch of individuals, each of whom have their own particular ethical orientation and commitments, and yet together we have to do something or achieve something that is a kind of collective action of all of us. And so in doing that and navigating that, I think it's quite important to be, so there are a number of different resources that you bring to the table. So one is obviously, organizations do have their own kind of ethical personality. They have their own history, their own set of commitments. It's not static, it evolves over time. And one of the things that makes it evolve is obviously, the new groups, cohorts of people who come through it. And many organizations are, I think, have been quite profoundly changed at the moment, particularly by millennial and Gen Z employees who are starting to come through. But so it's not static, but it is certainly a kind of resource, and every organization will have a kind of identity, a kind of historical resource to draw from, and part of what navigating and negotiating this has to look like is is for a particular leader is about how you can bring your own sense of ethics and commitments to that already existing context, and how do you think about what happens if there is a conflict between that. I think at the end of the day, it's really important for every employee, every executive, every leader to be able to draw that distinction and to say, okay, if this divergence is too great, then it's my responsibility ultimately to follow my own conscience. And ultimately, that can mean by stepping out of that role or stepping out of that particular function or task. And it's interesting because it was a debate that happened quite significantly within the military around individuals who were not pacifists, but who had a very, very strong personal objection to a particular operation. So the Israelis, the IDF, have kind of been dealing with this for many, many years. It occurred in the UK and the US over the operations in Iraq, for whom a number of officers had very, very strong moral objections. And of course, the military is an organization that traditionally has not given you that freedom. You sign up, you sign up. You don't get to choose what you fight in. But in different ways, so the IDF in Israel actually created a a right of selective conscientious objection. So if soldiers, said that they did not feel personally comfortable in participating in operations in the occupied territories, that they wouldn't be forced to do that. So I think, I think in the case of a really significant conflict, that's the ethical thing to do. Occasionally you might be tempted to think, gosh, where there's a, where I clearly see what the right thing is to do, and all of these other people in the organization don't, to kind of go rogue in a way. But I think that very, very seldom ends up in a good place.
So okay. So I'm seeing a kind of four-box matrix, of course, inevitably, where you've got the sort of time pressure on one axis and complexity on the other axis, and I just want to drill into a couple of those scenarios in a bit more detail. So we're in a situation where we've got time, but it's a complex decision-making process. And we've got our values all nailed down. We know all of that. We've got all of our guidance around how that. So then there's, I don't know, half a dozen of us who are tasked with taking this decision. What's the sort of process that you go through? What's the is there a process? Do you have a process? And also, what's the sort of because the other thing that I see very often is that these things turn into circular conversations where people don't actually take a decision. They just go round and round and round, debating the same thing effectively over and over again, just trying to use different language because people aren't getting their point of view, or that's how they perceive it maybe. And actually, they might not be disagreeing by very much, but they're failing to take a decision for whatever reason. So, what process do you put in place to make sure that the right things are discussed and that the decision actually gets made in the end?
Yeah. So one of the things that we often find is very helpful, and that we often get asked to kind of to help organizations, often boards or management teams on, is to create a kind of an ethics brief, which you might think of as being very similar to the kind of brief that a law firm would give you, a legal opinion. So what you want from, it's obviously something that you can do internally, you can do for your own decision making as well. But the answers that a kind of an ethics brief wants to give you is first of all to lay out the facts of the decision point, and in particular to work through the consequences of the impacts of this decision. So there's a step of first of all thinking, okay, who are the different parties that are going to be impacted on by this? What are the impacts, both long term and short term? Both the intended, and the unintended. What are the ways in which impacts could be generated through, second and third order effects, like perverse consequences? So all of these kinds of hidden impacts that might not immediately be obvious, and who will they impact? And that's often just a very, very helpful starting point, because the way that these decisions, very often go wrong is just because we're focusing improperly on, one set of impacted stakeholders, or one kinds of impact or effect. And just laying out, as fully and as thoroughly as you can often help to clarify a lot of this. The second thing that you want to do is then to say, okay, if this is the set of potential actions that we have, and these are the long and short term consequences of those actions for these relevant stakeholders. What are the kinds of ethical reasons that are going to be relevant to this? So this is where, having a little bit of moral philosophy can really help. So one of the ethical considerations is just that these impacts may be good or bad, right? They may create benefits or they may create harms. And almost all complex actions that businesses take will create a kind of spectrum of benefits and costs. They'll hurt some people and they'll harm some people. So there are some pretty straightforward tests that you can immediately apply to an action, right? Is the decision going to create more benefits than costs? If it doesn't, then you've probably got your answer right there. And is it maximally creating benefits over costs, or at least is it creating a really good surfeit of benefits over costs? Are there straightforward ways that we could minimize the costs? Yeah, so a number of pretty straightforward things you can apply. Secondly, we want to ask the question of whether amongst those stakeholders who are impacted, particularly those who are impacted negatively, do any of those have rights not to be impacted in that way? So to say that someone has a right is to say a very distinctive thing about them. Is to say that there is an ethical reason that we have that kind of stands before anything to do with costs and kind of benefits in the aggregate. So it is one of those red lines that we spoke about before. So if you have a right to life, or right to liberty, or right to education, what that means is if I'm the relevant duty bearer to that right, that I need to make sure that I secure those things for you before I do anything else, right? Before I worry about the P&L, before I worry about, whether I'm doing, a great kind of, bringing a great kind of beneficial product to the world. Those are things I just need to attend to, right at the outset. So again, really, really important thing to say, out of all these people who are affected, which amongst these have particular rights, in other words, particular claims on our action, and to be really clear on whether those exist, and if so, what they require us to do. Thirdly, we also need to look at considerations of equity and fairness. So equity and fairness is different again to kind of, just measuring and weighing off the balance of costs and benefits, and it's different to rights. It's to say, okay, if we are creating a distribution of costs and benefits, between different groups of customers, or between employees and shareholders, or wherever it may be, what is a fair allocation of that, and what does what does equity look like in that situation? So kind of just asking those questions and laying out how these decision points will affect those different questions can take you a considerable length down the way as well. Now, the final thing that you kind of need to do then is, very often what will happen in the most difficult decisions is that there will be trade-offs or differing directions between those different approaches. So you might find that, that something gives you the opportunity to do, a whole bunch of great, do great good in the world, but it raises issues around rights or around equity. And so, articulating those trade-offs just really, really openly, and kind of not trying to kind of circumvent them or brush them under the carpet, enables you to do a couple of things. First of all, it enables you to ask a whole set of design questions to say, okay, the way that we've structured the decision at the moment, we just have this ineluctable trade-off between, rights and equity, for example, or, equity and benefits. Is there something that we can do to change the way we're thinking about this product or this market or this action that will help, if not to eliminate that, at least to mitigate it? So that can often take you quite a way in itself towards a solution. And then, at the end of that whole process, if you still have a real remainder, if you still have something that looks like a really, really significant trade-off, that it's going to be something that is going to create, ethical costs, whatever you do, then you can face it openly, and you can say, this is the trade-off that we faced. We've made it in this way for these reasons, after having gone through this process of making sure we're aware of all the considerations, of really mapped them, of understanding where the trade-offs are, trying to redesign the situation. And you can be confident at that point that you've done that in a way that is that's transparent, that has been done in light of all of the relevant ethical reasons, and hopefully can be defensible on that basis.
Okay, so I've got a process here which goes context, options, consequences, costs versus benefits, harms versus goods, red lines around rights impacted, equity and fairness. So that's all in that consequence, the choices bit, and then but you've got to actually make a decision. And that this is I think that there's very often an inherent vulnerability in decision making. someone's actually got to, or a group of people, I mean, they actually have to put their neck on the line and say,
Yeah.
You know, unpopular as it may be with this group of people, risky as it may be in this context. You know, I think about car manufacturers deciding to switch from combustion engines to electric. You know, really tough decision. You know, but you either just keep going around in circles or you take a decision.
Yeah.
And how do you make sure you get to a decision? Do you have a do you, I mean, all of the models I can think of, like voting or time boxing, seem very blunt when you're trying to take a tough decision. So how do you do it?
Yeah, so look, I don't know that the kind of practice of moral philosophy that we we engage can do that, and I think often the decision gets made just because it has to get made, and often we often worry about decisions that are made actually too quickly rather than not being made at all. And a lot of these decisions they do get made because you have no choice but to make a decision. So the question then is are you, so there's a rather different concern to the concern that.
Well, I tell you what. So one thing that's occurring to me is, of course, you can elevate the risks within your context piece or within your consequences piece. You can elevate the risks of not taking a decision. I mean, another good example is climate change, isn't it? We have so far failed to robustly take the decision to defend the climate.
Yeah, although of course that is a decision, right? The decision not to act is itself a decision.
Absolutely.
So that's a very, very dangerous decision, because it's a decision that's been made. It doesn't feel like a decision. It doesn't feel like every day that we wake up, we're like, oh, we're taking a decision to push up action on climate change. It feels like not taking a decision, but of course it is.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point. Is how do you what is a good way, a positive, a constructive way of really, I mean, maybe this must happen in the military. What's it? A decision has got to be made, but if you time box it, then perhaps you don't pay adequate attention to certain things. If you make it a vote, well, some people might have much better perspectives than other people, and that doesn't necessarily make it robust anyway. It just sort of diffuses the responsibility. So how do you so you can elevate the consequences of not taking, of just failing to take a decision, and recognize that it is a decision. If you just decide to roll it over for another day or another week or another decade, that is a decision for which you are just as culpable as another decision. Is that how you do it?
So look, I think it's I think what you're really talking about here is how to overcome a kind of psychological deficit that we have, which is that it can be very easy for us to push off taking action in a way that makes us believe that we're not making a decision. And climate change is a great example where that's just a really, really dangerous kind of behavior. And when we fall into that trap, we incur very significant risks. Kind of existential climatic risks, but also ethical risks, because what we're doing is we're kind of risking doing something really, really bad, ethically bad. You can also think of other situations where the problem is the converse, where the problem is actually to stop our kind of stop our hot-headedness, our kind of our desire to kind of push forward. And it'd be an interesting question about which one of those is the more prevalent danger. So I don't think I would want to kind of phrase the challenge as being one of how to kind of force us to make decisions and kind of overcome the kind of decision-making lethargy, because I think it's one component of a kind of multi-dimensional set of psychological problems we have, some of which probably are countervailing. From an ethical point of view, what seems to me important in both of these, or at least in the first of those, your kind of worry about kind of putting off the decision and believing you're not making it, is it's kind of an awareness problem. Is that we're not fully aware that what we're doing at the moment, i.e. nothing, is actually a kind of very significant moral act. So we're not aware that actually, not that the doing nothing is an act, or it can be an act. It can be
so what you've actually got to do is apply the same process of cost and benefits, harms and goals, equity and fairness, red lines. You've got to apply that same process to failing to take a decision.
Yeah, and look, and you have these problems everywhere, right? In investment theory, it feels, the decision about whether to buy an equity feels very different to the decision about whether to sell it, right? So people will often say, well, I wouldn't buy that equity. It feels very, very, very highly priced at the moment. But if it's in your portfolio, you wouldn't necessarily see, you have to look at it and say, well, gosh, look at how much it's gone up. I'm very glad I own that equity. And it's a variant of the same issue, right? Action often just feels different to us than inaction. Yeah. But often it's actually a very, to come back to that rationality point, it can be very, very similar or actually identical consequences in terms of your, investment objectives on one hand and ethical on the other.
So the other, there was another bit of that I had in mind. I'll come back to that. So okay, that's great. So when you come to the instant decisions, the decisions that have to, a loan that need to be taken very quickly in a military context or a business context, and you've got your values, you've got your moral framework, that's all in place. But how do leaders? Because again, I think it comes back to this vulnerability point. What can you say to leaders to sort of help them over that point?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think a big part of the answer to that lies in the right kind of use of process, but also understanding the limitations of process and kind of allowing for enough independent action and decision making outside of that, right? So particularly large organizations that have to make a lot of these kinds of decisions very rapidly. Say, for example, loan decisions. You've got to have a process that basically tells your people what the right answer, or at least the right set of parameters are going to be in 99.9% of the cases. And that's the way, largely that you address this kind of hygiene question, right? We all know, that, we have to brush our teeth, but how do you get to doing that absolutely consistently every day? Well, you create structures and you create things that remind you and you create guardrails, and that's exactly what banks do to manage, loan decisions. But there will always be situations, there will always be odd calls and odd decisions that have to be made where the process is not going to get it right, because the best design process in the world cannot account for all eventualities. And there's a great example around this, actually, which I love, which is around a loan, managing a loan. So Steve Mukin, when he was being assessed for the role in the Treasury, he got a huge amount of heat for decisions that that I can't remember which bank it was, but he was on the board of one of the US banks, and it was notorious for making terrible to around lending and foreclosure. And one of the examples was just absolutely amazing. So there was this elderly Black woman who had she'd fallen into arrears on her loan, and what had happened is that she'd sent off a check to the bank for her payment that month, and she'd got the decimal in the wrong place. So they wrote to her and said, you have to read it. So she sent another check, and instead of sending it for $230.47, she'd send it for $237.07 or something. And so they foreclosed the loan and evicted her from her house. And it was one of those amazing cases where absolutely everything had been done by the book. The rules had, very, very clear rules about what you had to go through and what should happen. And the rules had been applied, and yet they'd got to a decision that, any person with a modicum would say that this cannot be the right outcome, either for the customer or for the bank or for anyone. So So what you're left with is actually quite a complex dance you have to do. So you have to, really communicate that, process is there. Process is really important. It's really important that we understand the process and that we apply it. But equally, that we ask you to come as a human being and actually to reflect on cases like this. And maybe you wouldn't want the loan officer just to take the call in the zone, but you want to create at least an expectation that you escalate that and say, this is what the system tells me to do, but is this really what we want to do? And that's the kind of sweet spot where you really want your organization to be in. You can't have everybody making kind of these existential decisions every single time and thinking about, my God, what are the long-term consequences, and is it going to create second and third order effects? No, most of the time you just got to follow the process, but you need to allow a space and communicate to your people and also upskill your people, right? So, a lot of what we do in organizations in the military was actually just kind of in conversations like this, often, but kind of more concrete, getting people to think and reflect and kind of use these ethical muscles so that when those kinds of cases come on, you have that awareness, you're able to say, yeah. And I think, and that's not an easy thing, but I think that's where the solution to a lot of these lie.
Okay, so I remembered my previous point. So what we would typically say, so it's interesting that you say that the problem is people taking decisions too quickly. And I'm worried about people not taking decisions at all or deferring decisions for too long. And I think actually, on reflection, typically the solution that we recommend to that is one of effectively experimentation and iteration. So actually take the minimum scale impact decision that you can now, experiment and iterate, rather than rather than deferring a perfect decision because you can't agree, or rushing an imperfect decision at too big a scale. So if you can think of a sort of in agile terminology, a minimum viable product to experiment with, and I guess the build on that would be with a process attached to it. So what's our review process or our development process from that point? I mean, does that work
So I think that is a great solution for certain kinds of problem areas. So we something very similar to that in the area that we call responsible innovation, which is something that a lot of the big technology firms have been experimenting with at the moment. So the idea of responsible innovation is very much, as you said, it's to create a set of tools and practices that really live within your design, development, and technology functions, rather than kind of separately in a kind of legal or policy function, that enables people to experiment with, first of all, to kind of become aware of some of those longer term potential impacts of a piece of technology or a product, but then to kind of iteratively experiment about how that is likely to play out, and what kinds of modifications to design you can make that would help to bring down the costs and raise the benefits. So it's a great solution in areas where that kind of iteration and experimentation is possible. It isn't always possible. There are some really big decisions that we make. So the decision whether to go to war or not is the kind of big daddy of all of those, right? You can't kind of, you've either got to go in or not, and the consequences are very, very unpredictable. In business, there are nothing quite as dramatic as that, but decision to enter a really significant new market, or even more significantly to leave a new market, those are really, really big, significant decisions that it's very difficult to kind of experiment. You can model them and scenario plan them.
You could experiment. I mean, it depends on your product, I suppose, but you could certainly test the waters on entering a market. Maybe harder to.
Yeah, and enter it. Yeah.
On exiting a market, it might be harder.
Yeah, depending on what what the kind of scale needs are, and and again, but so yeah, I think it is. I think it's a great methodology where it works, but there will be some things where
no, that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think at the end of all of this, I love it, and I think there's some really, really useful stuff here. I think the end of it leaders, if we're going to call them that, people who put themselves in a position where they will need to be taking decisions, actually have to be okay with being vulnerable. There's
Yeah.
no get out. You can mitigate it with process, and you can mitigate it with, good quality thinking and all the rest of it. But actually, if you're not prepared to be vulnerable, don't do the job.
I think that is 100% right, and it's particularly right for the really hard stuff, right? Because there's a bunch of stuff on the one hand that is just clearly and absolutely wrong, and there's a bunch of stuff on the other side that just clearly you have to do. That's not the hard stuff. The hard stuff is the kind of gray area in the middle where it's just absolutely not clear what the right thing is to do, or where there are these trade-offs where whatever you do, you're going to cause some harm to someone, and somebody is going to be unhappy. And in those kinds of situations, there is often no one single correct answer. And it's certainly, you can't hire someone like me to come along and make the decision for you. It has to be, it has to be authentic to your leadership and to your organization. But it's in situations like that where having a kind of toolkit, drawing on the elements that we've talked about, right? So, really reviewing and understanding as comprehensively as possible what the context is, being as clear as possible about how you understand that context, where the trade-offs are, which are the values that you are drawing on, and why. People may not agree with the question, with the decision that you've made, but at least they will have a sense for where that decision has come from, that it's been made honestly and rigorously and after a process of real reflection. They may still disagree with it, but there's, they'll be able to understand it and kind of see transparently where it's come from. And but at the end of the day, that kind of vulnerability, that's not going to go away. That's part of the job of being the leader.
David, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. If anyone wants to get hold of you, how would they do that? How would people find you?
Go look at principia-advisory.com, the website, or shoot me an email, david@principia-advisory.com.
Fantastic. Okay, David. Really brilliant to talk with you. Thank you so much. I'm sure people will find this extremely valuable.
Amazing. Thanks for letting me. It's been a real pleasure.